Thursday, July 27th, 2023. In the first game of a doubleheader, Shohei Ohtani takes on Michael Lorenzen with Derek Thomas umpiring, only his 8th game behind the plate. With one out in the bottom of the 6th, Ohtani pitches a beautiful cutter that nicks the outside corner, but Thomas calls it a ball. Now this is as tough as a pitch to call as you can get. Only a quarter of the ball is within the zone, and it's moving away from the umpire who's set up on the inside of the plate. An inaccurate call, but not a terrible one. But what's impressive is outside of that one pitch, Thomas called a perfect game according to pitch tracking. Everything else that was on the edge of the zone, some of them equally difficult calls, Thomas got it right. 121 out of 122 called pitches were correct, over 99% accuracy. We know this because Umpire Scorecards released their scorecard of the game. But there's other things the scorecard shows, including consistency. Before I show you what Umpire Scorecards rated his consistency, what do you think it should be? Based on what we know so far, his zone was almost identical to the true zone displayed on screen. It should be 98 or 99 or 100% consistency, right? But Umpire Scorecards rated this game at 94% consistency, or about league average. How does that make any sense? They come up with this number based on the estimated ump zone. Based on what we know already, the estimated ump zone should almost be identical to the true zone. But here's what they show as the estimated ump zone. Despite never making an incorrect call in the top third of the zone, Umpire Scorecards estimates that he will call something there a ball. They also have some areas outside the strike zone that they estimate Thomas would call a strike, areas that aren't even close to his one incorrect call. This estimated ump zone makes no sense whatsoever. And this isn't unique to this game. It's something that happens a lot in Umpire Scorecards. Pat Hoberg's perfect game in the playoffs, 96% consistency. This game by Mike Eastbrook where he had 98% accuracy and only 3 missed calls, 91% consistency. What's happening here? Why is Ump Scorecards missing the mark so much when it comes to consistency and the estimated ump zone? What else are they getting wrong, or what else is misleading on their scorecards? Gonna break down the things I don't like about Umpire Scorecards and provide some constructive criticism and improvements they can make to address these issues after the intro. I gotta start out of the gate. Despite what I'm going to talk about in this video, I love Umpire Scorecards and the work they do. They keep track of ump accuracy and keep umps accountable. I recommend going to their site, umpirescorecards.com, joining their Patreon, following them on Twitter, and generally supporting them. They're the reason we know Pat Hoberg is the Babe Ruth of umpires, and Joe West was the Unieski Betancourt of umpires. But when I like something, I tend to critique it more because that thing I like can be even better. We're not doing cinema sins here and nitpicking stuff that doesn't matter.
Okay, I was gonna send the weird Vietnam War movie anthem, but a smiley face on Mars? That is worth 5 sins.
The Martian smiley is real. It's called the Gall Crater.
I'm gonna try to give actual constructive criticism. For those unfamiliar, let's start with an example Umpire Scorecard to show what's on there. This is the Mariners at the Yankees on June 22nd of 2023 with Liven Sparger as the umpire. First, we have overall accuracy, which is just the number of correct calls divided by the total calls. There's expected accuracy and relative accuracy, which is something they added in 2023 that I really like, but we'll get into exactly what's happening there and why I like this change, but why I dislike the presentation. Then you have overall favor. This is just taking every incorrect call, calculating the run expectancy before that call, calculating the run expectancy after that call, and crediting the difference for the team that benefited from the call, and then adding up the total for the game. More on that later. Then there's overall consistency. How they calculate this is they use their generated estimated ump zone, calculate the percentage of calls that aligned with that estimated ump zone, and show that here. So in theory, if an ump calls a wide strike zone, but does that consistently the whole game, it's going to show poor overall accuracy, but might show high consistency. Then we have the estimated ump zone itself overlaid on what I'm going to call the true zone for the rest of the video. On here it shows all calls that are incorrect according to the true zone, along with the 3 most impactful incorrect calls according to that change in run expectancy I talked about earlier when discussing overall favor. Finally, we have the called ball accuracy as well as the called strike accuracy. This one's pretty self-explanatory. For every pitch that was called a ball, the percent of them that were accurate according to the true zone, and for every pitch that was called a strike, the percent of them that were accurate also according to the true zone. Since I talked about it in the intro, let's start with consistency and the estimated ump zone. Umpire Scorecards uses a smoothing technique called kernel density estimation for their estimated ump zone. How this works, you get a whole bunch of pitches called in a game, strikes and balls, and the kernel density estimation weighs where all of them are and tries to find a barrier in between strikes and balls called to get an estimated ump zone. But there's a problem with this that I'm going to illustrate with an example. Let's say there's a cluster of 10 strike calls at the bottom of the zone. Then there's a cluster of 10 ball calls just above the zone. Kernel density estimation is going to find the barrier between the two and say that everything above this line, the ump will call a ball, and everything below this line, the ump will call a strike. You can see the issue here. Despite having no incorrect calls in the upper half of the zone, the estimated ump zone will still assume the ump will call a ball in that half of the strike zone. You'd think this shouldn't be an issue because there's anywhere from 120 to 180 called pitches in every game. There's no way they'd be distributed in clusters like this. But that's where actual baseball strategy comes into play. When they throw a strike, most pitchers try to keep the ball down and on the corners, as that's harder to hit for most batters. And when they try to throw a high fastball and get a swing and miss, they want to get that just above the zone. Batters, on the other hand, are looking for a mistake pitch, which is usually something that catches too much of the upper part of the zone. Batters also tend to swing less at pitches in the lower part of the zone. This means, in practice, you're going to have a lot of games that mimic my extreme example. There's going to be a lot of called pitches in the lower part of the zone, a lot of called pitches above the zone, but a bit of a dead spot in the upper half of the zone because any pitches there, batters are more likely going to swing at it. This is exactly what happened in Derek Thomas's game I showed at the beginning. Every pitch but one in the top third of the zone was swung at. The one that wasn't, Thomas called correctly a strike, but for the reasons I stated earlier, Ump Scorecards views this call as inconsistent. In their estimated ump zone, this dead zone in the top third of the strike zone is assumed to be called a ball because there are a number of ball calls just above that area and only one strike called in that area. Another problem is there's no boundary for ball calls. The Derek Thomas game we're looking at had a really high number of pitches that were way outside or way low, and very few balls that were just outside or just low in the zone. This is why you get those little jut-outs for the estimated strike zone. All the ball calls were way out here, there's a couple strikes right on the edge, and the boundary between them ends up being way outside the ump's true strike zone. Therefore, we get a whole bunch of correct ball calls on the edge labeled as inconsistent. To fix this would require them tweaking their modeling system, which I certainly don't have the expertise to do, but what I would like is for them to have a way for the estimated ump zone to start exactly the same as the true zone and to form only with each incorrect call or inconsistent call after the estimated ump zone has been deformed. Give the ump the benefit of the doubt that they would have made the correct call in an area until they show they don't. This would lead to a lot fewer oddly shaped estimated ump zones, unless the ump truly earned it with some bad calls. The kernel density estimation they use isn't completely useless. With larger and larger samples that get rid of the dead spots where no calls occur, it can give you insights into the tendencies of each individual ump. If you looked at a whole season for an ump, you'd have enough called pitches where there are no dead spots, and we would know how an ump tends to call each region both inside and outside the strike zone. I think having season-long ump profiles available on their site using this system would give great insights into things like this umpire tends to call low and away strikes to right-handed batters, or this umpire has a very low strike zone. But the kernel density estimation does not do well in smaller samples. One game is a small enough sample where you get a lot of wonky results, making their estimated ump zone and consistency score very inconsistent. But this isn't the only change I'd make to Umpire Scorecards. One thing that gets missed on their scorecards are not all incorrect calls are equal. Ump Scorecards treats a pitch incorrectly called by a quarter inch the same as an Eric Gregg miss 2 feet outside the zone. And I think that's really misleading because Eric Gregg missing a dozen calls like this in one game versus an ump missing a dozen calls right on the edge will come out with the exact same accuracy and potentially the same consistency score. Kudos to them though, because they added expected accuracy and relative accuracy at the start of 2023. What they're doing here is adjusting for the fact that not all games are created equal. If you have a pitcher like Greg Maddux on the mound that just dots the edges and corners the entire game, that's going to be a harder game to call accurately than a game with Rick Ankiel with the yips where he's throwing 5 feet outside of the zone. There's also batter aggressiveness that comes into play. If batters are swinging all game on those pitches on the corners, it bails the ump out. While if batters are laying off those edge pitches, it's tougher for the umpire. What expected accuracy does is take where all the called pitches in a game are, determines the difficulty of each call, and what accuracy an average ump would be expected to get in that game. This expected accuracy can vary game to game by quite a bit. So far in 2023, we had a game with as low as 88.3 expected accuracy, and another with as high as 97.1. Ump Scorecards also added the ump's relative accuracy versus expected. So if it's plus, that means you called an above average game versus expected. If it's minus, it means below average. In our two extremes of expected accuracy, while Adam Hamari called only 92% overall accuracy and Manny Gonzalez called 97%, I personally consider Hamari's the more impressively called game because he was 4.1% higher than expected, while Manny Gonzalez was slightly under expected. I think this expected accuracy is the most important number on an ump scorecard to determine if they had a good game or a bad game, but I'm in the extreme minority here. Most fans don't look at it, care about it, or even know what it means. I ran a poll on Twitter asking, when looking at an ump scorecard, what's the first number you look at? And relative accuracy was just 6.6% of respondents. Overall accuracy was way in first at 45% of the respondents. While I really like relative accuracy, and I like that Umpire Scorecards added it, I think there's a better, more intuitive way to show what they're showing here. A change I'm proposing is to replace relative accuracy with what I'm calling total distance missed. What you do is for every incorrect call, calculate the distance from the edge of the true zone. A strike called 2 inches outside the strike zone would be 2 inches added to the total. A ball 1 inch inside the zone would be 1 inch added to the total. You add up all these distances for a whole game and get a final number. For example, if there's 2 games with 100 called pitches in each, and one ump misses 10 calls according to the true zone, while one ump misses 5, overall accuracy for the first ump will be 90%, while for the other it will be 95%. But let's say all of those 10 missed calls for the first ump are only a tenth of an inch from the edge of the zone, and those 5 missed calls from the second ump are all 2 inches from the edge of the zone. The first ump gets a total distance miss of 1 inch for the game, while the second ump gets a total distance miss of 10 inches. That intuitively tells you which ump was really worse. Relative accuracy, in effect, says the same thing, but it's not intuitive to understand what it's saying at first glance. I think if total distance missed replaced relative accuracy, a year down the line if I ran that same poll, total distance missed would score very highly. It's just easy to understand and interpret what total distance missed is telling you. I would love it if Umpire Scorecards looked into making this change. Now on to overall favor and most impactful calls. This one gets the most attention when it comes to Twitter comments. It's become a meme at this point to say, game rigged for X and they still couldn't win, for any team that got the ump's favor but still managed to lose. And I don't dislike overall favor. It's a perfectly fine metric. But if you look at any game with a favor of 2 runs or more, the majority of them are going to have one thing in common. A bases loaded, 2 out, full count, ball called a strike, or something similar to that. That situation right there is a 1.7 run swing and throws off the favor metric. Go to Ump Scorecard's listing of every game, sort by largest favor scores, and look at the most impactful missed calls. You'll see a bases loaded 2 out, full count, incorrect call in almost all of them, or a call that's somewhat close to that situation. I'm going to show you an example of what I mean. For this pitch, we have the perfect camera angle to see whether it's on the edge or not. You make the call. Is this a strike or a ball? Keep in mind that we're looking at slow motion replay with an added strike zone box to help us, while the ump doesn't have any of that. If you said strike, you showed 1.78 run favor for the Blue Jays, which that call by itself would be the 26th worst called game in 2023 in terms of favor. If one pitch is off the zone by a millimeter and the ump calls it a strike, which I think is a perfectly reasonable call, especially if it's consistent with the ump zone all game, if it's in a bases loaded full count situation or something close to that, the ump scorecard is going to set the narrative that the ump was biased towards one team. I don't want ump scorecards to get rid of favor score as it's very useful, but this is more on fans to understand that favor score can be lopsided without it being a poorly called game, and you really need to drill down into the impactful calls to see if it was something ridiculous. Yes, if an ump calls something 4 inches outside the zone a strike in a bases loaded full count situation or something similar to that, break out the pitchforks because that's a monumentally bad call. But if it's 1 millimeter outside of the zone in a similar situation and they call it a strike, that's perfectly reasonable. But the favor score is going to swing heavily for one team on that call. There isn't any change to Ump Scorecards I'd implement with this, but it's something I want readers of Ump Scorecards to keep in mind when reviewing them. So with everything I've gone over, how do I personally read an umpire scorecard? The first thing my eyes are drawn to is relative accuracy. Did the ump do better or worse than expected? Then I'll take a glance at overall accuracy, but relative accuracy is doing the heavy lifting on how I judge an umpire. Then I look at all the missed calls, completely ignoring the estimated ump zone, to see with my eyes if there are any trends or any monumentally bad calls. I'll cross-reference that with the most impactful calls to see if there were any calls that really screwed up the game that were also very bad. I pretty much ignore consistency for the reasons I mentioned earlier, as well as the estimated ump zone. And I only really pay attention to overall favor if those impactful calls I reviewed earlier line up with the narrative that the ump messed up in a way that heavily favored one team. For called ball and called strike accuracy, I only use that to judge if the ump had a larger or smaller than normal strike zone. If called strike accuracy is way lower than called ball accuracy, that means the ump had a larger strike zone. If called ball accuracy is lower than called strike accuracy, that means the ump had a smaller strike zone. As we can see from the average called strike accuracy being lower than the average called ball accuracy, most umps in the league tend to call a larger strike zone than defined by the rules. My method of review might change if Umpire Scorecards makes any of the changes I suggested. If they add total distance missed, that would be my go-to metric. If they revamp their estimated ump zone model for single games, I might pay attention to that, as well as overall consistency.